These are the 7 cities with the biggest income and wealth inequality across America. Put simply, if you're someone who's rich in these cities, life is great. Yet if you're someone who's poor, you could end up homeless. It's no secret that income and wealth inequality across America is surging over the last several decades, especially over the last couple years. The top 1% of Americans in wealth control $44 trillion of net worth. The bottom 50% only control $3 trillion, a trend which has gotten much worse since the start of the pandemic. This cavernous and growing gap in wealth inequality in America is contributing to higher rates of crime, poverty, and homelessness, particularly in the 7 cities that we're going to look at on this list, which are really struggling right now. These are not places that you want to move to, and if you already live in these cities, you want to think about getting out. Additionally, as we go through the 7 cities on this list, I want you to think about what they have in common, because there is a common trait, a commonality that these cities share, and as we go through the video, think about what that might be. I'm going to reveal the answer at the end. Starting with number 7, this is a place in the South where there's lots of rich neighborhoods and there's lots of poor neighborhoods. There's places where homes cost over $2 to $3 million, and then there's places where homes cost $100,000. Where am I talking about? That would be Atlanta, Georgia. The bottom 20% of income earners in Atlanta make about $31,000 a year. Meanwhile, the top 20% of income earners make $220,000. That's a massive 700% delta between the bottom and the top across Atlanta. And you can see this income inequality is segregated geographically. The areas in red in Atlanta towards the south and southwest of the city have poverty rates ranging from 25 to 40%. Meanwhile, these areas in blue to the north only have poverty rates of about 3 to 7%. So it's really a situation in Atlanta where there's areas in blue, which are the haves, and then the areas in red, which are the have-nots. And given the massive housing bubble that we're in right now across America, in Atlanta specifically, this situation is becoming more exacerbated. People who own homes in Atlanta have seen massive appreciation on their investment over the last 2 years, while renters have been stuck paying 20% higher rent. The typical renter household in Atlanta earns $48,000 a year, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, while their annual rent is now $22,000, according to Zillow, meaning that the typical renter household is paying nearly 50% of their gross income to rent. Further exacerbating matters is that real estate investors in Atlanta have a tendency to buy up all the homes in poor neighborhoods and push up prices and rents, which aggravates the situation and leads to more volatility and economic downside for people who live in these poor neighborhoods in Atlanta. But if you thought Atlanta was bad in terms of income inequality, you're not going to believe our number 6 most unequal city metro area in America. This is a place where housing costs are absolutely ridiculous. They've gone out of control over the last 5 to 10 years, and as a result, we're seeing lots of people leave this place. We're also seeing lots of people thrust into homelessness now in this area because they can no longer afford the rent, and they definitely can't afford to own a home. Where am I talking about number 6? That would be San Francisco. And if you want to talk about a city that really is a situation where there's the haves and the have-nots, it would be San Francisco. This is an area with so many rich people due to the presence of all of these big tech companies in the Bay Area, like Google, like Facebook, like all the tech startups. That means that there's a lot of people making a lot of money. The top 20% of San Francisco's income earners earn over $300,000 a year on average. Meanwhile, the bottom 20% earn only $43,000, a 700% difference. I believe these numbers would look even worse if so many middle class and lower income people hadn't already fled San Francisco due to the high costs. So the fact that it still looks this bad is shocking. Additionally, if you're the typical renter in San Francisco, there is zero chance that you will be able to ever afford a home. The typical home price across the metro in San Francisco is, get this, nearly $1.4 million. That's 16 times what the typical renter in San Francisco earns. returns. Those sky-high prices to go along with escalating mortgage and interest rates means that a new home buyer in San Francisco can expect to pay nearly $90,000 a year in ongoing home ownership costs. For perspective on just how crazy that $90,000 home ownership cost figure is, consider that the typical median household income in America is $68,000. So a new home buyer in San Francisco is having to pay 50% more in home ownership costs than the typical household in America earns in a year. And of course, the result of all of this is a massive flight out of the city. San Francisco is losing people left and right, and it's also causing a massive homelessness problem. There are now estimated to be 30,000 homeless people across the San Francisco Bay Area, and that number is growing by the day. If you're someone who's trying to climb the socioeconomic ladder, make more money, and save more money, San Francisco is the last place you should consider moving to. Now, I want to get you all prepared for our number 5 most unequal metro area in America, because this place is very different from San Francisco. Rather than having sky-high home prices, our number 5 most unequal metro is actually pretty cheap in terms of its housing market. However, it actually has even more income inequality than San Francisco. The top 20% of income earners in this metro make about $190,000 a year. Meanwhile, get this folks, the bottom 20% only make $18,000. That means that the richest people in this metro make 1,000% more than the poorest people. Where am I talking about? Well, you can see it on the screen right here. That would be Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis shares some similar characteristics with Atlanta, our number 7 city, because on the surface, it actually seems like it might be an affordable place to live. The home prices are fairly low. However, when you dig into the numbers and see how little renter households make in Memphis, it's really shocking. The typical renter household in Memphis only makes $35,000 a year, while the annual rent is now nearing $18,000 a year. That means that the typical renter in Memphis is spending over half of their income on rent, a ratio that's even higher than the levels in San Francisco. And folks, I feel like I shouldn't have to explain this, but I will. If someone is spending over half of their gross income on rent, that puts them in a very economically fragile situation. At best, it means they're not saving very much money, if any money. At worst, it puts them at a high likelihood of defaulting on their lease and getting evicted. Now, the high rates of poverty and economic insecurity in Memphis also make it, get this folks, the highest crime metro in America. That's right. No place in America has more rapes, murders, assaults, and manslaughter charges as Memphis, Tennessee. The violent crime rates in Memphis are more than 3 times the US average and make it a very dangerous place to live, particularly in the poverty-stricken urban locations towards the center of the city that you can see in red on this map. Now, our number 4 most unequal metro in America is actually a place that I think a lot of you would expect to be on this list. When I reveal the name in just a second, you're going to say, oh, that makes sense, because this is a place that is just way too expensive. We talked about rent. We talked about home ownership costs before in a place like San Francisco. Well, they're just as bad, if not worse, in this city. A typical renter here needs to pay nearly 60% of their income to rent costs. And say that renter wanted to try to buy a house to not waste money on rent. Well, sorry folks, that's not going to happen. The typical renter in this metro would need to spend nearly 100%, almost all of their income, on ongoing mortgage payments and property taxes to be able to afford a house. So put simply, renters can't afford the homes in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, like San Francisco, is a place with huge levels of wealth. Places like Malibu and Beverly Hills and Venice Beach are high-income destinations with home values upwards of $2, $3, $4, even $5 million. However, if you move from the blue areas on the coast to the dark areas in red towards the center of Los Angeles, you see lots of poverty, you see lots of economic insecurity and low income levels. The sky-high rents and the sky-high home prices combined with the relatively low levels of income for service workers and renters in LA means a burgeoning and exploding homeless population. Data collected in early 2020 suggested that there were over 65,000 homeless people across LA County. 65,000, that's crazy. And one of the fundamental reasons is because people in LA can't afford to live there. The low-wage economy and the low-wage jobs in Los Angeles are not that good. In fact, a lot of them have been lost since the pandemic. Meanwhile, the city of Los Angeles and the county makes it very difficult for builders to build new homes and apartments. This lack of building ultimately squeezes housing supply and has pushed the typical home value in LA to nearly $900,000 according to Zillow. And that's the typical value, $900,000. Once again, that's not the value for a nice place. That's the value for your run-of-the-mill property in your run-of-the-mill location. I mean, just take a look at this listing on Zillow. 3-bed, 2-bath, 1,100 square feet for $850,000. This place looks like, no offense, but kind of like a shack. And someone in LA needs to pay $850,000 for this unfinished home. And so if you're someone who's middle class or lower income who wants to build wealth for yourself and be able to afford or buy a house, get the hell out. Now folks, so far on this list, we've seen a lot of inequality throughout Atlanta, San Francisco, Memphis, and Los Angeles. But now I want to get you all ready for the top 3, because the top 3 take income inequality, income insecurity, economic insecurity to the next level. These are places where there's lots of rich people who live good lives, who drive around in their cars with their toy dogs and their convertibles, smiling, having a good time. Then on the other side of the tracks, you have renters who make $20,000 a year, $30,000 a year, who can't afford the rent. And quite simply, these top 3 cities are in absolute crisis mode right now with their local societies and economies, given how much inequality there is. Starting with New Orleans at number 3. I think this is going to be a surprise to some of you to see New Orleans on this list. Like Memphis, it's a place that on the surface seems like it might be an affordable place to live, but then when you dig into the dirty details, very quickly you realize it is not. The bottom 20% of income earners across the New Orleans metro make about $18,000 a year. The lowest level on this list, even less than Memphis. Meanwhile, the top 20% of income earners in New Orleans make $194,000 a year. That means that the highest earners in New Orleans make 1,100% more than the lowest earner. That is the highest differential of any metro area in America. One of the reasons for this is that New Orleans has never really recovered economically from Hurricane Katrina. This natural disaster occurred over 16 years ago in 2005. However, its effects are still being felt. For instance, New Orleans' population today is still lower than it was before Katrina happened in 2004 by about 6 or 7%. It seems like New Orleans is never going to be able to get back to that previous level of organic and economic growth. This is, of course, hurting people on the lower end of the income spectrum in New Orleans most, because their careers, their earnings, their wages are most tied to the broader growth of the city. And if the city's not growing, it's going to be the poor people who suffer most, not the rich people. Now, our number 2 most unequal metro in America, where the income inequality is raging, where there's rich people but then very poor people, is the worst place to be for renters in America. That's right. When you compare how much renters earn in this city, in this metro area, to how much rent is, as I'm going to show you in a second, you're going to be flabbergasted, because residents in this metro are spending 70%, 70% of their income on rent. That's unbelievable. That's clearly not sustainable at a certain level in Miami, Florida. Miami is a place where the typical rent is $2,600 a month and over $30,000 a year. Meanwhile, the average renter earns about $44,000. Meanwhile, there's also loads of income inequality. The top earners in Miami, the top 20%, earn about $240,000 a year, while the bottom 20% earn only $24,000 a year, a nearly 1,000% difference. Miami is another metro where the income inequality is heavily concentrated on a geographic basis. Just take a look at this map. We're looking at the red areas. These are places like Wynwood and Little Haiti. They have poverty rates around 30%, median income levels of $26,000. But if you go south to a place like Coral Gables, it's very high income, very low poverty. If you go to Miami Beach, it's the same situation. This has been made a lot worse over the last 12 months, with rents in Miami up nearly 30% in a year. 30% in a year in Miami. A lot of that's due to all of the new people moving to Miami, but it's also due to a lot of real estate investors getting involved, buying up properties, flipping homes, jacking up rents. I would not be shocked in Miami if we see quite a few lease defaults and evictions over the next 12 months as these economically fragile people are not able to keep up with these soaring rents. Now, before we get to our number one most unequal metro area in America, I think some of you might have some questions. I can already tell a lot of you are thinking, you're asking yourself, what are the similarities that these cities on this list have? What are the things that are driving this income inequality in these 7 cities? And I think I can point out a couple obvious things from the start. Number one is expensive real estate. Most of these areas, maybe not Memphis or New Orleans, but most of these other ones have high rents and high home prices. But the second thing I noticed is pretty interesting. It's actually more political in nature, and that's that most of these areas are very liberal. That's right. Whether you look at Atlanta or San Francisco or LA or the number one city that I'm about to show you, these are all very liberal places that have the most income inequality. And this is an interesting observation because liberal and democratic policy makes it a point to try to prevent income insecurity and to fix income inequality, yet the areas that are most liberal have the most. Could this mean that it's actually liberal and democratic policies that promote and cause income inequality? Or could it mean that since the income inequality is present, that motivates the local people to vote Democrat? I don't know, I have a couple of my own theories about that, but I would love to hear in the comments section below what you think about this relationship between liberal progressive cities and income inequality. But before you leave that comment, let's now get to the number one most unequal metro in America. And put simply, folks, this wasn't even close. This was an obvious number one when I looked at the data in terms of rent and home cost and income inequality and how much rich people make compared to poor people. It was obvious that New York was always going to be number one on this list, particularly the areas close to and around Manhattan. Some of the richest people in the world live in New York, but then also some of the poorest people in the world live there. For instance, the highest segment of wage earners in Manhattan make over $300,000 a year, while the lowest 20% make only $25,000 a year. Meanwhile, the typical price of a home in Manhattan is nearly $1.3 million, pretty much just as expensive as around San Francisco. If you are a local renter, you likely will stay a renter in New York for your entire time being there, and that means that you're going to be spending on average over $3,000 a month on rent. These high costs in New York were more bearable when New York City had a bustling economy. However, over the last 2 years since the pandemic, New York's economy has gone into the tank. Jobs are down by 8% over the last 2 years. Restaurant reservations are down by 40%. Airbnb bookings are down by 30%. And the negative impact of this is being felt most on low and middle income earners across New York. I hope that New York can get its economic house in order because it's going to need to. If it doesn't, these figures are going to get even worse, and New York is going to permanently cement itself as the number one city metro area for income inequality in America. If you're someone who enjoyed this video, please make sure to do these 3 things. Number 1, smash the like button into oblivion. That's the best way to support this channel. Number 2, please make sure that you are a subscriber. Hit the subscribe button below and make sure you have subscribe notifications turned on. And then number 3, leave a comment. Let me know what you think about this list of cities. I want to hear your thoughts below. The data in this video came from 2 principal sources. Home value and rent data came from Zillow. I'm going to have a link in the description to where you can download that data for your city. And then data on income and poverty rates came from the US Census Bureau.